Go.
Peanuts.
Do it again.
My peanuts.
Do it like it hurts.
It hurts.
This morning on a story that broke hearts, police say a mother stood by and did nothing while her boyfriend beat her little boy for days.
No. It was like a monster. Like his eyes were black. There was nothing to him. Like he was just an empty person walking around.
The tragic story of Dominic Calhoun, a life cut short by cruelty and indifference. This morning, we delve into a case that broke hearts around the world. A case so disturbing that it not only highlights the deepest level of cruelty imaginable, but also exposes the tragic failure of those who should have intervened to protect a helpless child. Police reports tell the harrowing story of a mother who stood by, doing nothing, as her boyfriend mercilessly beat her 4-year-old son for days. The images of this brutality are haunting, like a monster's eyes staring back, empty and devoid of humanity. The child was nothing more than a broken shell, a spirit crushed under the weight of unimaginable cruelty. This is the heartbreaking account of Dominic Calhoun, a young boy from Grand Blanc, Michigan, whose innocent life was taken in April 2010 by the shocking and brutal abuse he suffered at the hands of his mother's boyfriend, Brandon Hayes. His story is one of immense suffering of a life cut short by violence, but also a story of a profound failure by everyone around him. Despite numerous signs, red flags, and opportunities for intervention, no one stepped forward to save Dominic. This tragedy forces us to confront a painful question. How could this happen? Dominic was born on October 17, 2005, to Corine Baker and Eric Calhoun. From the moment he arrived in the world, Dominic was a beacon of light in the lives of those around him. His bright blue eyes sparkled with curiosity and wonder, and his infectious smile could melt the heart of anyone who crossed his path. As he grew, his passion for life and exploration became evident to everyone who knew him. He was a boy with a zest for adventure, a lover of nature, a curious spirit who found joy in the world around him. Fishing trips with his grandfather were a highlight for Dominic, where he developed a deep appreciation for the quiet serenity of nature. In these moments, he found peace and connection with the world. Back at home, his playful nature was evident as he spent hours in the backyard with his beloved toy tractor, imagining himself in a world of his own, a world where he could be anything he dreamed of. Dominic's bond with his older brother, Tyler, was unbreakable. The two of them were inseparable partners in crime, always coming up with new games, adventures, and mischief. They would roughhouse together in the yard, their laughter echoing through the air. In quieter moments, they could be found huddled close, lost in their own little world, creating memories that, in hindsight, would be all too fleeting. Dominic's kind heart extended not just to people but to animals, too. Whenever he encountered a furry friend, his face would light up with pure joy. Dogs were his special companions, and he would shower them with affection, receiving their sloppy kisses in return. It was clear that Dominic had a rare gift, the ability to connect with all living things, a gift that made him beloved by those who knew him. But despite the love surrounding him, Dominic's early years were marred by instability. His family life was marked by constant upheaval, frequent moves, unstable living conditions, and a pattern of strained relationships. In 2009, Corine's relationship with Dominic's father, Eric, came to an end, and the custody of Dominic was granted to her. This decision, however, would later be questioned, as Corine had long struggled with severe substance abuse problems. She had been known to make reckless decisions, even putting her unborn child at risk during her pregnancy with Dominic. Many were left wondering how such a woman, with her history of instability, could have been deemed a fit parent for a young child. Just months after her separation from Eric, Corine became involved with Brandon Hayes, a man with a criminal record that included multiple convictions for domestic violence, assault, resisting arrest, and drug offenses. Yet, despite his troubled history, Corine pressed forward with the relationship. eventually moving in with him after just 3 months of dating. She brought her sons, Dominic and Tyler, into this volatile new living situation. At first, things appeared to settle, but it didn't take long for trouble to rear its ugly head. Brandon's explosive temper and controlling nature quickly became apparent. His anger was unpredictable and disproportionate, especially when it came to money. He resented the fact that Dominic's biological father, Eric, was often late with child support payments, rather than understanding that Dominic was an innocent child caught in the middle of adult conflicts. Brandon saw him as an unwanted burden, something that added to his frustrations. The simmering tensions between Corine, Brandon, and the children finally came to a head on April 8, 2010. What began as a small, accidental incident quickly escalated into something much darker, something no child should ever experience. Dominic, sitting quietly on the couch, watching television, had an accident. But instead of a caring, compassionate response, Brandon's reaction was swift and brutal. He unleashed his fury on the 4-year-old, striking him repeatedly. Each hit, each blow was a reminder of the terror Dominic was enduring. When Corine attempted to step in and protect her son, Brandon turned on her, too. Grabbing her by the hair, he struck her while shouting, "Who's going to pay for this?" His rage knew no bounds, and Dominic, the helpless child caught in the crossfire, became the target of his unrestrained violence. The violence did not stop there. It continued the next day, with Brandon attacking Dominic again. Corine, desperate to protect her son, tried to intervene once more, but her attempts were futile. Brandon's anger was unrelenting. His words echoed in the apartment, "He deserves the worst punishment imaginable." Dominic's condition rapidly worsened, and by April 10th, his injuries had reached a critical level. As the days passed, Dominic's suffering became unbearable. His tiny body, once full of life and energy, was now battered and broken. But the brutality didn't end. Each strike was more savage than the last, as Brandon subjected Dominic to unimaginable horrors. The sheer cruelty and malice in Brandon's actions were beyond anything that could be rationalized or explained. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that there were numerous opportunities for someone to intervene, to stop the violence before it was too late. Corine's family, including her father and uncle, saw the signs of abuse. They witnessed Dominic's swollen, burned hands and bruised body, yet they failed to take action. Corine herself refused to seek help, too afraid of being blamed for her son's injuries. Neighbors, who heard Dominic's anguish cries as pleas for his mother to make Brandon stop, also failed to act. They chose silence, leaving the child to suffer in agony. Even those who were closest to Dominic, who should have known something was wrong, chose to ignore the red flags that were painfully obvious. This indifference, this apathy, is what makes the tragedy even more profound. By the time Dominic's condition was discovered, it was too late. On April 11th, Corine's sister, Christina, came to the apartment to visit, and what she found shocked her to the core. Dominic lay motionless, his body battered and barely clinging to life. Corine initially tried to claim that he was just sleeping, but Christina could see the truth. Dominic was not just sleeping, he was dying. It was then that Christina called for help. What followed was a desperate attempt to save Dominic, but the damage had already been done. He was rushed to the hospital, but the extent of his injuries was far beyond what any medical team could repair. The brutality of his wounds left even the most seasoned doctors and officers in disbelief. His tiny body was covered in bruises, burns, and broken bones. The most severe injuries were to his head, where the swelling was so extreme that doctors had to remove part of his skull in an attempt to relieve the pressure. But there was no hope for recovery. After days of suffering, surrounded by his grieving family, Dominic was taken off life support and passed away on April 12, 2010. He was only 4 years old. The unthinkable horror, Brandon's torture of Dominic. Brandon's cruelty reached new heights on April 10, 2010. when he dragged the barely conscious Dominic from his bed to the living room, turning the space into a scene of unimaginable suffering. What followed was an endless nightmare of violence, one blow after another. The merciless attack, which defied all human logic, was not just physical, it was designed to break Dominic in every way possible. His hands were burned so severely that the skin hung in shredded pieces. His eyes, targets for Brandon's rage, were repeatedly struck, each blow leaving him more blind to the world around him. Dominic was thrown violently against walls, his fragile body crumpling with each impact. His teeth were shattered, his face disfigured. The unrelenting brutality inflicted on a child so small, so vulnerable, was beyond comprehension. What makes this horror even more heartbreaking is the fact that there were opportunities for someone to intervene, to stop this madness. But these chances were missed, ignored, or dismissed by those who could have made a difference. Investigators later discovered that, at least twice during the 4 days of torment, Corine, Dominic's mother, had left the apartment without Brandon. Once, she went on a shopping trip with Brandon's father and uncle, where Brandon became enraged about spending money on her sons. Another time, she left for a medical appointment with her parents. Astonishingly, at no point did Corine give any indication that something was wrong with Dominic. She did not ask for help. She did not express concern. Brandon's father, Arnold, and his uncle, Rodney, witnessed firsthand the disturbing condition Dominic was in. His hands were severely burned and swollen. His head was bruised badly. They begged Corine to take Dominic to the emergency room to seek the help that was desperately needed. But Corine refused. She feared being blamed for her son's injuries, choosing to ignore the advice of those around her. When Rodney confronted her again, separately from Brandon, Corine dismissed him, brushing off his concerns. This failure to act in the face of such clear signs of abuse would be a constant source of pain. For those who love Dominic, what is perhaps most staggering is the number of adults who were aware of Dominic's peril, yet chose not to act. Neighbors heard anguish cries, the unmistakable sound of a child pleading for his mother to stop the violence. One witness recalled hearing Dominic's voice, crying out, "Mommy, make him stop." Yet not a single person picked up the phone to call for help. Not one of them attempted to intervene, to rescue this child from his torment. There was a next-door neighbor who had actually been inside the apartment and seen Dominic's condition. But tragically, this person chose to remain silent. This indifference, the apathy of those who could have made a difference, is one of the most crushing aspects of this tragedy. How many times must a child scream for help before someone listens? It wasn't until the 4th day of Dominic's nightmare, April 11th, that the true extent of his suffering was finally revealed, but by then, it was far too late. Corine's sister, Christina, and some friends arrived at the apartment to make a purchase from Brandon. When they walked in, they were confronted with the unimaginable sight of Dominic lying in his bed, battered and burned, his body barely clinging to life. Corine, still in denial, tried to claim that Dominic was just sleeping, that he was simply resting. But Christina knew better. She could see the horror in Dominic's condition, the deep, obvious injuries that told a far darker story. At last, Christina realized there was no time to waste. She called Dominic's paternal grandfather, Rick Calhoun, for help. When Rick arrived at the apartment and saw his grandson broken, bruised, and bleeding, lying on a blood-soaked blanket, he wasted no time. His heart shattered at the sight of Dominic's ravaged body, and he immediately called 911. The emergency responders arrived within minutes, but even the seasoned officers and paramedics who came to the scene were visibly shaken. One police officer, overcome with emotion, momentarily lost his composure. In a moment of raw anguish, he shouted at Brandon and Corine, "What kind of monsters are you? Look at this little boy." Dominic was rushed to Hurley Medical Center, where doctors fought to save his life. He was suffering from catastrophic head injuries and massive brain swelling. The medical team had to remove a portion of his skull to relieve the pressure on his brain, but it was clear that the damage was beyond repair. The doctors, who had seen countless cases of abuse, were struck by the severity of Dominic's injuries. Nearly every inch of his small body was covered in bruises, including the soles of his feet. The extent of the damage was the worst any of them had ever encountered in their careers. On April 12th, after spending a day in a critical state, Dominic's family gathered around him. With no hope of recovery, Dominic was taken off life support. Surrounded by the people who loved him, he passed away from his injuries. He was only 4 years old. The arrest and aftermath. Brandon Hayes was arrested at the scene and faced a number of serious charges, including first-degree murder and child abuse. During his interrogation, he admitted to his brutal actions but attempted to implicate Corine as well, attempting to shift the blame onto her. Corine was also arrested, charged with second-degree murder for failing to protect her son. The weight of their actions, their utter neglect and cruelty was incomprehensible to Dominic's family, who were left to grapple with the shocking reality of how he had died. The aftermath of Dominic's death was devastating for his family. His father, Eric Calhoun, along with Dominic's paternal grandparents, expressed their grief and anger at the justice system. They raged at the fact that Dominic's life had been so senselessly taken, and that those who should have protected him had failed him so utterly. They vowed to seek justice for Dominic and ensure that those responsible for his death would be held accountable. The trial of Brandon Hayes, which began in January 2012, was a heartbreaking journey for Dominic's family. The evidence presented in court painted a horrifying picture of the abuse Dominic had endured. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence of the injuries Dominic suffered, detailing the bruises, burns, and broken bones that covered his small body. The courtroom fell silent as first responders, doctors, and medical examiners gave their testimony. These professionals who had seen their fair share of trauma were visibly shaken by the extreme nature of Dominic's injuries. One of the most emotional moments in the trial came when Dominic's 8-year-old brother, Tyler, took the stand. Tyler had witnessed the torture his little brother endured, and his brave recounting of the abuse was heart-wrenching. The strength it took for Tyler to relive those traumatic moments in front of a courtroom full of strangers was extraordinary. His testimony was a powerful reminder of the lasting impact that such trauma can have on the family members who are left behind. Brandon's defense team attempted to argue that his judgment had been clouded by drug use, and they tried to shift the blame to Corine, claiming that she was more responsible for Dominic's death than Brandon. However, the overwhelming evidence of Brandon's violent history and his actions during the abuse was undeniable. After an emotional trial, the jury deliberated briefly before returning a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree felony murder and torture. Brandon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for his monstrous crimes. As the verdict was read, there was a palpable sense of relief in the courtroom, a sense that justice had been served, even though it could never undo the pain caused by his actions. Justice had been done. Brandon's reign of terror was over. The aftermath, grief, legacy, and the fight for justice. In the wake of Dominic's death, there was an overwhelming sense of loss, a void that nothing could fill. At Corine's sentencing, her words echoed with hollow remorse. Every single day, I made horrible choices throughout my whole life, and those horrible choices were paid for with the death of my son. I will have to answer to God for me, she said. Her attempt to express regret fell on deaf ears. To Dominic's family, her words held no weight. They had watched her stand by, powerless or unwilling to protect the son she had brought into the world. For them, nothing could make up for the loss. Nothing could bring Dominic back. The grief that his family endured was unfathomable. There was no sentence, no measure of justice that could heal the deep wound left by Dominic's death. The pain extended beyond his immediate family and touched the community that had watched him grow. Dominic had been a bright light in the lives of everyone who knew him. His laughter, His bright blue eyes and his endless energy were part of what made him so special. Friends and family shared stories of the vibrant boy who loved to run around pretending to be Spider-Man, wearing his superhero costume, or dancing enthusiastically to Michael Jackson songs. He had a zest for life that no one who met him could ever forget. At his funeral, the pain of loss was almost too much to bear. Family and friends wore blue ribbons, Dominic's favorite color, symbolizing their unity and grief, and their love for the little boy who had been taken far too soon. They came together not just to mourn, but to honor the memory of the child whose life had been stolen. In their eyes, Dominic was not just a victim. He was a reminder of the failures of the system meant to protect him, a failure that had cost him his life. The family's anguish transformed into a powerful drive for change. They wanted Dominic's death to mean something more than just a tragic story. They wanted it to spark reform. In Dominic's memory, they established a foundation aimed at preventing child abuse and supporting children in dangerous situations. Through this effort, Dominic's legacy lives on, not just as a tragedy, but as a catalyst for change in child protection services. Dominic's paternal grandfather, Rick Calhoun, channeled his heartbreak into action. "I'm happy, but I'm sad here," he said. "Every day, I think about it." He would have been 6 years old on Monday. He would have been in first grade right now. Rick's words were filled with the weight of a grief that would never leave him. But he also carried hope, a hope that by fighting for better laws, he could help protect other children from the same fate as Dominic. The foundation that was established helped to pave the way for new legal reforms. In 2012, thanks in part to Rick's tireless efforts, Dominic's law was signed into effect by the governor of Michigan. This law stiffened the penalties for child abuse, particularly when the abuse occurred in the presence of another child. It was a small but important step in ensuring that children like Dominic would be better protected in the future. Yet, true justice for Dominic remains elusive. In 2023, the Michigan Parole Board granted Corine Baker, Dominic's mother, who had failed so egregiously to protect her son, parole after serving only 13 years of her sentence. This decision sent shockwaves through the family, whose anguish at her release was almost too much to bear. They had fought so hard for justice, and yet, in their eyes, this parole decision was a slap in the face. Their pain was palpable. How could someone who had watched her son suffer, someone who had been complicit in his death, be allowed to walk free after so little time? Dominic's story should serve as a clarion call to us all. His unimaginable suffering and the failure of the adults in his life to intervene illustrates a painful truth. Child abuse often hides in plain sight. The neighbors who heard Dominic's cries but didn't call the police. The grandfather who took Dominic on outings only to return him to a home that was a prison. The relatives who saw clear signs of abuse but chose to walk away. They are all part of this tapestry of tragedy. What happened to Dominic was not inevitable, it was preventable. How many children like Dominic are out there right now, silently suffering, desperately in need of someone to speak up for them? Dominic's story challenges us to look around, to open our eyes, and to find the courage to act. We must do better. We must be better. If we can find the compassion to intervene when we see something wrong, we can save lives. Every life matters. No child should ever endure the horrors that Dominic faced in his final days. Dominic's legacy is not just about the tragedy of his death. It is a reminder of the responsibility we all share to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It is a call to action to speak out when we see abuse, to support the efforts that prevent it, and to ensure that no child is ever left behind. By honoring Dominic's memory, by refusing to let his death be in vain, we can make a real difference. As Rick Calhoun so poignantly said, "I just know that he would look at me and say, 'Good job, Grandpa.'" We owe it to Dominic and to every child out there to do our part in preventing such senseless tragedies. Through our collective efforts, we can protect the most vulnerable among us and ensure that their voices are heard, their pain is acknowledged, and their lives are valued. reflection on the tragic story of Dominic Calhoun, a call for change and a prayer for the innocent. The heartbreaking story of Dominic Calhoun is one that no one should ever have to hear. Yet it is a grim reality that too many children face in silence. A sweet, bright-eyed little boy with a love for life and an infectious smile. Dominic was cruelly stolen from the world by the very people who should have been his protectors. His tragic death, inflicted by the hands of his mother's boyfriend and compounded by the utter failure of those around him to intervene, is a painful reminder of how fragile the lives of the most vulnerable among us can be. What makes Dominic's story even more difficult to bear is the profound sense of failure, not just from the perpetrators, but from everyone who could have stepped in to save him. The neighbors who heard his cries and did nothing. The family members who witnessed the physical signs of abuse and chose silence. The system that failed to act in time to protect him. This is not just a personal tragedy for Dominic's family, it is a collective failure that we, as a society, must confront and change. We must never allow another child to suffer as Dominic did. His story is not just a reminder of the cruelty that can exist in the world, it is a call to action. It calls upon each of us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more willing to step in when we see a child in need. There should be no more excuses, no more turning away when we see the signs of abuse or neglect. We must do better. We must protect the innocent, stand up for the voiceless, and ensure that every child, no matter their circumstances, has a chance to live a life free from harm and fear. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future through the efforts of Dominic's family, through the passing of laws like Dominic's Law, and through the continued advocacy for child protection. We can work towards a world where no child is ever left to suffer alone. But this change begins with us. Each one of us must take responsibility to protect the most vulnerable, to intervene when we see something wrong, and to demand that our communities and governments take the necessary steps to safeguard children. As we reflect on Dominic's life, we cannot help but feel the deep sorrow of a child who was taken too soon. But in our grief, we must also find hope. Hope that his story will inspire change. Hope that the legacy of his short life will save others. And in that hope, we offer a prayer for Dominic. A prayer for Dominic. Dear God, we come before you with heavy hearts, grieving for the loss of a precious child who was taken from us too soon. We ask that you surround Dominic with your eternal love and peace, and that his spirit find comfort in your embrace. We pray for those who knew him and loved him, his family, his friends, and his community, that they may find healing in the midst of their pain. Lord, we ask that you open our hearts and our eyes to the children who are suffering around us, and give us the strength and courage to intervene, to protect, and to love as you would. May Dominic's story not be in vain, but serve as a reminder to us all of the importance of standing up for those who cannot stand for themselves. We pray that we, as a society, do better for our children, protecting them, nurturing them, and giving them the opportunity to grow up safe, loved, and happy. Dominic, though your life was short, your light shone brightly. You touched so many lives in your brief time with us, and we will carry your memory in our hearts forever. May you rest in peace, sweet boy. We will honor you by doing everything we can to protect those who are still with us. Amen. In the face of this senseless tragedy, we must remember that we hold the power to make a difference. Through our actions, we can ensure that no child has to face such horrors again. It is a responsibility that each of us shares. Let us do everything we can to ensure that Dominic's story is not forgotten, and that his legacy lives on in the change we make in the world.